What if the real shock in human evolution is not that the modern human lineage is older than we were taught, around 1 million years old, but that once you accept that possibility, the entire prehistoric world changes its shape? Because if the modern human lineage reaches deeper into the past than the old textbooks allowed, then sapiens did not emerge into an empty stage. After 1 million years in Eurasia, around 500,000 years ago, the ancestors of modern man returned to a crowded and deeply unsettling African continent already occupied by other human forms, some massive, some small, some bizarrely proportioned, some disturbingly familiar from a distance, and profoundly wrong up close. This is the part that museum displays rarely capture. In museums and reconstructions, these archaic human beings are often softened, arranged into a reassuring sequence, their strangeness managed by artistic convention until they seem like rough drafts of ourselves. But the fossil record, when stripped of that visual comfort, points toward something far more uncanny. It points toward a world in which modern humans may have moved through landscapes shared with heavy-faced archaic hunters, long-armed ape-men, cave-dwelling survivors, and populations whose bodies and skulls carried combinations of traits that do not sit easily inside any clean narrative of progress. This is not pseudoscience. This is the new paradigm shift taking place in paleoanthropology. Once that world is taken seriously, prehistory stops looking like a calm procession and begins to look more like first contact, repeated again and again, a tense and dangerous collision between related forms close enough to recognize one another and different enough to inspire fear. The old timeline was emotionally convenient because it kept modern humans insulated from too many rivals. If Homo sapiens were late, if they appeared as a refined final act and spread quickly, then all the older lineages could be treated as background, as failed experiments already fading by the time the real story began. But as the age of our lineage has been pushed deeper, and as deep population structure, archaic admixture, and early branching models have become harder to ignore, that insulation has begun to collapse. The result is not simply a longer history for us, it is a more crowded history. A deeper modern human lineage means more overlap with forms once treated as remote, and overlap changes everything. It means that populations like those represented by Homo ergaster in Africa, Homo erectus across Eurasia, and Homo naledi in southern Africa are no longer just evolutionary stepping stones pinned neatly to separate moments. They become contemporaries, neighbors, rivals, and perhaps in some cases sexual partners and mortal enemies. The question is no longer just who came first, but what happened when they met. That meeting would not have felt like the gentle gradation imagined in children's books. Turkana boy is a good place to begin because he is one of the fossils most often used to make the early human body feel familiar. Tall, long-legged, narrow-bodied, he has been turned into an icon of the endurance runner, the adolescent striding towards modernity across an open savanna. Yet this image depends heavily on reconstruction, interpretation, and a willingness to emphasize the familiar over the primitive. The underlying anatomy has always been less simple. Debates over the spine, thorax, pelvis, growth, and developmental pattern all point to a creature more distinct from us than the reconstruction admits. The skull, with its long, low vault, receding forehead and projecting face, is not a modern human skull with minor rough edges. It belongs to a different human. The jaws are stronger, the face more forward, the entire cranial architecture more committed to a bodily design we no longer inhabit. He was tall for his age, suggesting he had an ape-like growth pattern, not a modern human growth pattern. New reconstructions show that he had a flared chest and wide pelvis, not the narrow chest and pelvis shown in museums. Fully human in an important and undeniable sense, yes, but not modern human. And once one begins to see Turkana boy not as an almost boy like us, but as a member of another kind of human altogether, the rest of the record becomes easier to read in the same harsher light. As an adult, he and his kin may have been more like his close relatives, the Dmanisi hominins, short and powerful with massive jaws. Because the deeper one goes into the Middle Pleistocene and earlier Late Pleistocene record, the more one encounters populations that are not merely archaic in a technical sense, but unsettling in their presence. Heto man, with its enormous face and battered, almost overbuilt expression of cranial mass, does not look like a gentle forerunner waiting politely to refine itself into sapiens. It looks established, territorial and real. The brow is massive, the face broad and projecting, the cranial vault low by modern standards, and the overall impression is not of deficiency, but of a different engineering logic. These were not people one would have mistaken for our cousins in a moment of panic at the edge of a campfire. They would have been recognized instantly as human enough to matter and strange enough to alarm. That uneasy mixture may be the central feeling of early contact. The uncanny valley is often discussed as though it were a modern response to robots and digital faces, but prehistory may have contained its own version of it. A figure crossing an open plain with a human gait, carrying tools, organizing in groups, tending fire perhaps, and yet bearing a face too heavy, a jaw too great, a posture too unlike our own in the details, might have produced exactly that reaction, recognition contaminated by revulsion and fear. Homo naledi pushes that feeling into another register altogether, because here the proportions themselves begin to look wrong in a way that museum labels struggle to domesticate. Small-brained, but with feet surprisingly human-like in some respects, curved fingers suggesting climbing retention, shoulders and trunk carrying older patterns, Naledi refuses to stay in the comforting category of primitive ancestor. The body is a mosaic, and mosaics are often more disturbing than clean forms because they scramble expectation, a clear descendant of Homo habilis who lived nearly 2 million years ago. One part says human, another says archaic, another says something almost improvised by evolution in a dark chamber away from the main line. The hands seem capable, the legs tell one story, the upper body another, the skull yet another. If modern humans overlapped with beings like this in Africa, then the continent was not a simple cradle but a patchwork of human experiments persisting side by side. Modern humans were not moving through a world in which all other humans resembled them enough to feel ordinary. They were moving through a world full of bodies that would have struck them as deeply wrong. That word matters less as insult than as sensory reality. Wrong for us, wrong relative to our own evolved expectations, wrong in the way a face can be recognized as human and still produce immediate aversion because its scale, angle, timing, or expression falls outside the familiar range. Homo erectus may be the most important case of all because it stretches across enormous distances and enormous spans of time, and because it is so often described in language that makes it seem safely ancestral. But erectus, especially in its earlier and classical forms, was not simply a rougher sapiens. The cranial vault is long and low, the forehead retreating, the brow continuous and commanding, the cranial bone thick, the face often strong and forward, the jaws substantial, the teeth in some populations robust, and the body itself variable but frequently powerful and old in its proportions. In older human forms related to that world, these humans held their ground for astonishing lengths of time. A species does not persist like that by being pathetic. It persists because it is successful within its world. If later modern humans entered landscapes still occupied by descendants or survivors of that grade, then the encounter cannot be reduced to a one-sided replacement of the inferior by the superior. It would have been more dangerous than that. The residents knew the ground. They knew the prey routes. They knew where stone could be found, where water remained in the dry season, where predators nested, where shelter could be improvised. The newcomers may have brought greater flexibility, greater symbolic capacity, more fluid cooperation, or advantages in distance technology. But the older humans brought something else: occupancy. Occupancy is often overlooked because it is not glamorous, yet it may be one of the decisive facts of prehistory. Wherever modern humans went, they entered terrain already understood by others. In Africa, that may have meant crossing into regions occupied by deep archaic lineages whose separation from our own stretched back astonishingly far. In Eurasia, it meant walking into territories where erectus descendants, Denisovan-like populations, Neanderthals, island dwarfs, and other ghost lineages may have persisted in pockets. Occupancy means ownership without paperwork. It means memory embedded in movement. It means hunting grounds that are not merely places but lived maps of danger and opportunity. And once one population enters the occupied territory of another, the possibilities narrow quickly. There may be trade at the margins, imitation at a distance, even mutual avoidance for generations. But sooner or later there is usually conflict, and sooner or later there is usually sex, because humans are neither so noble nor so discreet as later narratives would like. The history of our species, once one takes admixture seriously, begins to look like repeated oscillation between those two forces. Kill or be killed, absorb or be absorbed, dominate or disappear. It is brutal language, but it may be closer to the reality of deep time than the polished tranquility of museum walls. To say that to the victor goes the preferred mating is not to romanticize replacement. It is to acknowledge a pattern that echoes across animal behavior and human history alike. The winning population does not merely occupy land, it occupies reproductive space. If one group achieves dominance in a region through numbers, weapons, alliance structures, social cohesion, or simple control of resources, that dominance shapes who gets incorporated into whom. In some places, victorious males from an incoming population may have taken females from resident archaic groups, whether through coercion, prestige, or gradual incorporation. In other places, dominant resident males may have absorbed incoming women into local groups, especially where the newcomers arrived in small bands and could not hold territory alone. Sometimes the process may not have resembled conquest at all, but slow hybridization across frontiers, with children growing up in ecotones where lineages blurred. Yet the principle remains. Reproductive success follows power, and power in prehistory was inseparable from ecology and group cohesion. Once modern humans are made older, and once their overlap with super-archaic populations is taken seriously, the old family tree begins to look less like a branching diagram and more like the record of a series of hard-fought reproductive takeovers. This is why the visual language of museum reconstruction can be so misleading. It domesticates what should trouble us. Artists smooth skin, arrange hair, soften expression, and choose poses that imply contemplation rather than threat. The result is that even the heaviest archaic face begins to look approachable. Herto man becomes a solemn elder. Erectus becomes a weathered traveller. A Naledi becomes a curious cave dweller. Naledi becomes almost cute in its smallness. But real encounters would not have occurred under soft museum lighting. They would have occurred in failing daylight near water, in ravines, at cave mouths, on forest edges, beside carcasses, with smell, blood, noise, hunger and fear amplifying every difference. A projecting face is not merely a trait on a diagram in that context. It is an expression that arrives before the voice. Massive jaws are not just anatomy, they are visible force. Deep brow ridges cast the eyes differently. The skull sits on the neck differently. The gait carries differently across uneven ground. To call these forms nightmare fuel is crude if meant only as insult, but as an attempt to recover the emotional reality of first contact, it may not be far wrong. The horror would have lain precisely in the closeness, not beasts, not men as we know them, but near humans staring back. And modern humans, if they were indeed older and more widely distributed than once believed, would have been shaped by those confrontations. Their behavior, weapons, coalition structures and mating systems may all have been forged in worlds where other humans were part of the threat environment. One can imagine modern human bands developing tighter communication, not in abstraction, but because rival humans had to be tracked and outmaneuvered. One can imagine projectile technology becoming decisive not just against prey, but against larger-bodied hominins dangerous at close range. One can imagine myth, taboo and ritual emerging around the presence of these others. Some groups perhaps feared as cave-haunting predators, others as kidnappers, others as uncanny beings from the forest edge. That language would be lost to us now, but the evolutionary pressure would remain. To be modern in such a world may have meant not merely being smarter, but being better at surviving among other humans who were terrifying in ways lions were not. Lions are clearly other. These beings were not. The deeper implication is that much of what we like to call modern humanity may have arisen not in peaceful self-development, but in opposition. We became what we are partly because of the kinds of neighbours we had. The super-archaic populations of Africa and Eurasia were not scenery, they were selective forces. Some lineages may have disappeared because they could not compete. Some may have persisted by hiding in ecological corners, on islands, in caves, in dense habitats, or in marginal zones. Some were likely absorbed. The DNA record already tells us enough to know that our ancestry is not pure and never was. The fossil record tells us enough to know that body plans once existed far outside the narrow envelope of recent human variation. Put those facts together, and the old story of smooth ascent becomes difficult to take seriously. What emerges instead is a continent-spanning drama of repeated overlap, repeated danger, repeated intimacy, and repeated disappearance. Perhaps that is why the question of whether these beings were almost human or subhuman is finally the wrong one. It is a modern attempt to force clarity where prehistory may have offered none. To the people who faced them, the distinction would not have been philosophical. It would have been immediate and practical. Can they kill us? Can they take our women? Can we take theirs? Can we share a carcass, a cave, a spring, a valley? Are their children viable? Are they stronger? Are they many? That may have been the grammar of deep human contact long before language took the forms we know. And if modern humans are indeed older than we once thought, then those questions echoed across far more time than we imagined. Our ancestors did not simply step onto a planet prepared for them. They stepped into a world of rivals who looked too much like them and not enough like them. And what followed may have been the most intimate war in natural history. Even now, when we walk through museums and look into those reconstructed faces, perhaps the strangest thing is not that they seem familiar, but that we have worked so hard to forget how frightening that familiarity may once have been. Thanks for watching.